Welcome to topic 2, and there's going to be just one lecture for this topic, and it's taking a look at the 6 criminal justice perspectives. There's widespread agreement that the broad goal of the criminal justice system is social control. In other words, the goal and the role that the criminal justice system plays in our society is to maintain safety and order by preventing behavior that is deemed as threatening or harmful to society. The question is how best to achieve this goal. And depending on the different your perspective or a person's worldview, they're going to have very different takes on what is harmful or what's the best approach to preventing that harmful behavior. And so there's disagreement among the perspectives about what the main focus of the criminal justice system should be. There's disagreement about which behaviors are actually threatening to society. And in our next chapter, we're going to look at the different ways in which crime is actually defined. There's different ways to define a safe society. Is a safe society where there's absolutely no harmful behavior, or is a safe society one where only the most damaging kind of behavior is controlled? And what is the best way to prevent harmful behavior, etc.? And so, how a person answers those questions oftentimes springs from their political worldview regarding the criminal justice system. So let's go ahead and take a look at these different perspectives in a bit more detail. Here is just a little handy chart to refer to from your textbook that shows sort of a pie with all the different slices. So we're going to be taking a look at the crime control perspective, the restorative justice perspective, the non-interventionist perspective, the rehabilitation perspective, the justice perspective, or what your textbook calls now the equal justice perspective, and the due process perspective. After listening to this video, you are going to, and reading the textbook, you're going to engage in a discussion this week where you're going to be assigned a specific perspective, and then you're going to write about that perspective. And you're also going to be writing about how those in the criminal justice system would do their job if they're governed by this perspective. Keep in mind that this lecture is really just an overview of the key concepts that are in your textbook. So when you're engaging in the discussion, and also when it comes to tests in the future, the midterm test, make sure that when you talk about these perspectives and write about these perspectives, you are including information not just from this lecture, but from the textbook as well. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to start with the crime control perspective, perspective 1. We're starting here because this is the dominant viewpoint in the United States right now. Most politicians and lawmakers and just people in the general population subscribe to the crime control perspective. So let's take a look at this perspective. If we were in class together, we would put this quote from the famous book called Thinking About Crime that was written by James Q. Wilson, who's often seen as the father of the crime control perspective. We would put this quote on the screen, and then somebody from class would read it out loud, and then we would take a moment to sort of think about what this quote means before we would continue. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read this quote, and then I want you to pause the lecture, and I want you to maybe take out a piece of paper and a pen, or just sit there and think. And I want you to think about, like, what does this quote mean? What is James Q. Wilson trying to tell us about people in society? And from what he's telling us in this quote, what does it tell us about the crime control perspective, or the role that the criminal justice system should play in our society? So here's the quote. James Q. Wilson writes, "Wicked people exist. Nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And many people, neither wicked nor innocent, but watchful, dissembling, and calculating of their chances, ponder our reaction to wickedness as a clue to what they might profitably do. Okay, so pause the lecture for a second and just keep that quote up on the screen and take a moment to maybe summarize or to sort of translate that quote into your own words, kind of deciphering what the meaning of that is. Okay, so welcome back. So, what did you think about this quote? Let's take a look at it. So he says that wicked people exist, nothing avails except to set them apart from innocent people. And so James Q. Wilson is sort of talking about our society, and he's basically saying, look, there's some people who are just, they're born bad, they're born evil, and they exist. And there's really nothing you can do. You can't reform them, you can't rehabilitate them. Um, if we want to keep society safe, we just got to put these evil people behind bars. We need to get them away from the innocent people. And then he goes on and says, and many people, neither wicked nor innocent. And so he's saying, look, we've got innocent people, we've got wicked people. And so wicked people are the evil ones. Innocent ones are like, they're never going to do any wrong, right? Their kid could be starving and they wouldn't break into a convenience store to get them food to feed their kid because they would never break the law. They would never do anything wrong. You don't really need to worry about the innocent people. In a way, you don't really need to socially control them because they control themselves. But James Q. Wilson says that, look, most people are not wicked or innocent, but most people have a watchful eye. They're looking around and they're seeing, how does society treat those people who are evil, who are bad and do bad things. They're also sort of dissembling that, they may be pretending like they're good, but underneath it all, it's kind of a disguise that they're willing to do wrong things, but only if they think they can get away with it. And so they're calculating their chances. They're pondering our reaction to wickedness as a clue to see what they might profitably do. And so they're basically engaging in a cost-benefit analysis. This is a great quote because it really gets to the core of the key beliefs of the crime control perspective. And so let's take a look at those now. So from the crime control perspective, and you really get this from that quote, from the crime control perspective, they think that the main focus of the criminal justice system should be to prevent crime. So the main focus of crime control is to prevent crime. And that's what they want the sole focus of the criminal justice system to be. And they say, when they ask the question, why do people commit crimes? They say that people commit crimes because most people, not all, some are evil, some are innocent, right? But most people engage in a cost-benefit rational calculus. They basically say, what can I get away with? If I do something, if I break a law, if I engage in some harmful behavior that benefits me, am I going to get punished for it? And if I do get punished for it, is it going to be like a significant punishment? And they basically say, okay, what's the cost associated with engaging in this antisocial, harmful behavior? What's the benefit of engaging in that behavior? And if the benefit of engaging in that behavior is greater than the cost, then the individual will engage in that action, right? So it's like a burglar or a robber, right? Kind of looking around and wondering, hey, should I burgle that house? And they're like, well, what's the punishment for first getting caught for the first time for burglary? Maybe like probation. Am I going to get caught? Probably not. I don't see a lot of cops in this neighborhood, right? What could I get if I break into this house? I can get a lot of stuff. There might be drugs in the drug cabinet. There might be some money. There might be some jewelry, some electronics. I'm going to go for it, right? If they feel like the benefit exceeds the cost. And so from the crime control perspective, they basically treat criminals or potential criminals as rational actors. And they say the best way to prevent crime is to increase the cost. And the way that you increase the cost is, and this is total crime control perspective, that you need to be swift, certain, and severe, okay? In other words, that a person has to have a high level of certainty that they're going to be caught if they engage in bad behavior. Not only that, but the punishment that they're going to get is going to come right away, right? It's not going to be years before they get the punishment, waiting, working its way through the court system. But you get caught, and then you're going to get swiftly punished. And that punishment is going to be severe. It's not going to be probation. It's not going to be 3 months in county. It's going to be something really severe. And the thinking is that you are basically sending a message to those people who are thinking about engaging in harmful behavior, and then they won't do it. You're also sending a message to somebody who's engaged in harmful behavior that if you do it again, then you're going to get punished even worse. Okay? So, in a nutshell, that's the crime control perspective. Now, make sure you read in your textbook about the benefits of this perspective and where it falls short. Recidivism is really high in the United States. In other words, people are very likely to reoffend, even though we have some pretty severe punishments that are on the books right now that people are subject to. So make sure that when you're answering the question in the discussion and also on exams that you go into some critical thinking that they offer to you in the textbook. Now, I said that the crime control perspective is the dominant perspective in the United States today, and that is the case. It may be waning a little bit. People are getting sort of tired with the amount of incarceration that we have in the United States and the amount of money that's spent on the criminal justice system. So it's possible that we are moving away from that perspective. But prior to crime control perspective, the dominant perspective in the United States was the rehabilitation perspective. And in many ways, the rise of the crime control perspective in the 1970s and the 80s was a response to the ineffectiveness, what was seen as the ineffectiveness of the rehabilitation perspective. So let's go ahead and take a look at this perspective. For the rehabilitation perspective, the main focus of this perspective is on examining the social conditions and the treatment of those people who are engaging in antisocial, asocial, and harmful behavior. From this perspective, the rehabilitationist perspective thinks that people commit crimes because something is wrong, okay? That there is something wrong in our society. That the reason people commit crimes isn't because they are rational actors, that they're doing a cost-benefit analysis, but rather the reason that people commit crimes are social factors that are beyond most people's controls. And so what are some of those social factors? Well, for one, the rehabilitation perspective looks at the role that poverty plays in crime commission. And so you don't choose where you're born. You don't choose the family that you're born into. Some people are born into wealthy families, moderate families. Some are born into poor families. And the rehabilitation perspective basically says that when you're born into poverty, that there are a lot of social factors that impact your decision making. You might not get the proper nutrition that you need both before you're born, prenatally, and then after you're born. That might lead to problems with neural development and impulse control. You might live in a poorer house that is never been abated for lead paint, and lead paint that you consume leads to neurological problems, in particular problems with controlling violent tendencies. That when you live in poverty, you might not get the best education. The schools might not be as well funded. Therefore, you're not getting the tools that you need to make the right decisions. Or you might think, I'm not getting an education that's going to get me a job that pays well. Maybe there's another way that I can make money, and that money might be through some illegal endeavors. Okay, addiction. Mental health issues. Okay, the vast majority of people who are apprehended are suffer from alcohol addiction and drug addiction. And so, the rehabilitation perspective is saying that people who are drunk out of their gourd or on drugs, they're not doing a cost benefit analysis, right? They're impaired, right? And so from the rehabilitation perspective, the best way to prevent the crime is to address the conditions that cause crime, address poverty, address lack of education, Address why people don't have the proper skills they need to get a good paying job. Address disorganized neighborhoods that that can be a key factor in poverty. We're going to be talking about that more in future chapters. Address addiction and mental health issues. From their perspective, they're like, you can either pay now to treat those problems, right? You can invest money in poor neighborhoods. You can invest in better education. You can invest in drug treatment and mental health counseling. You can invest that now, and you're going to actually pay less than if you don't address them and you end up paying later. And the cost can be much higher. Not only the cost associated with incarceration, but the cost that comes from the harm that people who are not treated can meet upon our society. So that from the rehabilitation perspective, they say address the conditions that cause crimes and also treat the offender. Offenders aren't bad people. They're not making bad choices, but they're sick and they need treatment. And so that they basically think that offenders need the tools to get better. They need better education. They need job training. They need a counseling, etc. And so this is a perspective that's almost the polar opposite of the crime control perspective. Crime control perspective is all about personal responsibility. The rehabilitation perspective isn't saying that people don't have some individual accountability, but that society has a lot of accountability, because if society is producing criminals, we have to ask ourselves, how can society change in order to produce people that are pro-social and not or anti-social? Let's now move on to what is perhaps my favorite perspective. Not that we all have our biases, but it's probably because I teach civil liberties that gives me a bias towards the due process perspective. What due process means is that due process is about having a procedure in place where people that go through the criminal justice system, that there's a certain procedure that we follow, and that it's a procedure that's supposed to ensure just, fair, and equal treatment. And so that when we're taking away somebody's life or liberty, that those life and liberty that is being charged with a crime, tried for a crime, and then sentenced for said crime, and then punished, that we can do those things in a democratic society, but we need to do those according to a fair and just process that is followed by all. And so let's take a look at the key components of the due process perspective. Okay, so what is the due process perspective, and what is the main focus of the due process perspective? The main focus of the due process perspective is procedural fairness, aka due process. From their perspective, that when asked the question, why do people commit crimes? The due process perspective says, look, we're not really interested in the causes of crime, why people commit crimes. What we are concerned with is maintaining a democratic society. And what that means is that criminals should be afforded a fair process as they work their way through the criminal justice system. But they also sort of say that, while we're not focused on why people commit crimes, that if there is a lack of trust in the criminal justice system, that is that some people get different treatment or better treatment than others. Like rich people are, get an easier shake, or the process that they go through is significantly different than the process that somebody who's not as rich goes through, right? We talked about that when we were talking about the informal criminal justice system, that sometimes people that have a lot of money, celebrity cases, they go through all of the steps. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing, but they receive a different procedural justice than somebody who's poorer, who's maybe encouraged to take a plea agreement or gets a lower sentence or whatever it could be. That would be troubling to the due process perspective, because could be the sense that people are treated differently, right? And that because people are treated differently for arbitrary and capricious reasons, that people could have lack of trust in the criminal justice system, and that lack of trust could lead to jeopardizing the social contract. Right? The social contract is that, as citizens, we agree to follow certain rules, and that when people break rules, then we empower the government to basically punish people for breaking that social contract. Well, if we feel that not sometimes people break the social contract and there's no consequence for it, or sometimes people break the social contract and they are really get a harsh punishment, that inequity, that can lead to a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. It can lead to a lack of trust in our democratic society. And when people don't trust that, then they might not be very likely to follow the rules. Why is the due process perspective so concerned with protecting the rights of the accused? And we're going to be learning more about these rights as we go on. But, right, you have the right to remain silent. If you don't want to be questioned by the cops have to read you your Miranda warnings so that you're told you can be silent and wait for your attorney to be there. You have a right when it comes to trial, right? You can't be forced to testify against yourself. If you want a jury, you can get a jury, right? That they can't admit evidence that's been improperly or illegally collected. So why so much concern with the vigorous protection of the rights of those accused of crimes? Due process serves as a necessary check on the power of the state. Okay, if you don't write down what that procedure is, and gosh darn it, those procedures are written down in Amendment 4 through 8 in our Bill of Rights, right? The framers of the Constitution, and James Madison, who wrote the Bill of Rights, they spent a lot of time outlining due process, because they knew that the state is mighty and the individual is weak. And if you don't give those accused of crimes fair procedure that's actually followed, then the state will just trample on the rights of individuals. And that's particularly true for people who are charged with crimes. That if you're charged with the crime, even if you're not found guilty, people just assume that you are guilty, and that therefore they're sort of like, you're guilty, you really don't deserve these rights. But that is not the case. And also, even if you are guilty, the state still needs to make its case against you, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that you are in fact guilty. And so the due process perspective is basically trying to right that system and level the balance, right? To give more weight to the individual who's being prosecuted by the state, and placing a check on the power of the state through just procedure. Also, the due process perspective thinks it's a greater crime to punish the innocent than to let the criminal go free. And so, yeah, if due process isn't followed, a criminal may go free, but it's a much greater harm in a democratic society for somebody who actually is an innocent to be charged, tried, convicted, and punished for something that they did not do. So, for the due process perspective, it's important to maintain these rights because it's key to living in a democratic society. On to the non-interventionist perspective. And this is maybe going out on a limb a little bit here, but with the number of states that are legalizing marijuana, that it could be that we, at least for certain kinds of so-called harmful acts, we could be moving towards a non-interventionist perspective in this country. So let's take a look at this perspective in a bit more detail. So, for the main focus for the non-interventionist perspective is minimizing contact with the criminal justice system. From this perspective, they think that much of the contact with the criminal justice system is actually more harmful to society than the crime itself. And the reason that they think that contact with the criminal justice system is harmful is because it has a harmful impact on individuals, and it can also have a harmful impact on those the families of individuals that have contact with the criminal justice system. From their perspective, that when you have contact with the criminal justice system, you kind of get labeled as an offender, whether you are an offender or not. You've probably heard of the school to prison pipeline, that particularly young African American boys are much more likely in school to be sent to detention or to have contact with the school resource officer, kind of labeling them as, sort of like a pre-criminal. And then that label kind of follows them into, well, if a pre-criminal in school, then you kind of get used to being treated like that. When you have that label, you might actually try to make good on that label, okay? And so you'll read more in the textbook about the concerns that the non-interventionist perspective have on the effects of being labeled a criminal. Also, and maybe even more importantly, is the effects of being institutionalized. The vast majority of people who are charged with the crime and bound over for trial, if they enter a not guilty plea, they're not able to make bail, and they sit in jail until they are able to resolve their case. Well, the effects of institutionalization are very profound. And so even if you are innocent of the crime that you're charged with, but you're bound over and you can't make bail, basically an innocent individual can sit in the county jail. And in the meantime, they lose their job. They might lose custody of their kids. They're going to be around other people who either are criminals or are labeled as criminal and act out as criminal. And the impact that can have on families as well can be quite profound. And so, from the non interventionist perspective, they're just like, let's try to reduce as much as possible the impact and the contact that people have with the criminal justice system. Now, keep in mind, the non interventionist perspective is not saying let's decriminalize everything, right? What they're saying is they want to place emphasis on the crimes that do the most harm to our society. But other crimes that are less harmful, such as prostitution, low-level property theft, drug use, drug purveying, that they see those as sort of like, at least drug purveying, prostitution, those sorts of things, as victimless crimes. They really think that those should be decriminalized. And lower level crimes that are likely to, like property, harm to property and those sorts of things, they're going to say that those are harmful, but that they aren't so great. The harm isn't so great that it justifies the harm that comes with contact with the criminal justice system. They would much rather the criminal justice system focus on the most harmful behaviors and leave the rest to the side. And that when it does come to punishing non-violent offenders in particular, they are oftentimes wanting to have alternatives to incarceration, whether that's probation or work release or electronic monitoring at home. Okay, 2 more perspectives to go. Let's take a look at the restorative justice perspective. The main focus of the restorative justice perspective is creating a just and peaceful society. Now, let's be clear, the restorative justice perspective is not all like kumbaya, rainbows and unicorns. That's not what this perspective is about. What this perspective is about comes from the understanding they have about why people commit crimes. And they think there's a lot of reasons for why people commit crimes. But they think one main reason is that people who commit crimes fail to really understand the harm that they've caused the people through their criminal activity. And really, when you think about it, there aren't a lot of opportunities. I don't know if I want to use that word opportunity, but there aren't a lot of times where victim and offender come together. Sometimes in a sentencing for a very severe crime that takes place. But usually the victim or the offender has very little contact with the victim. And so they really never know how greatly they've injured or harmed that person. So from the restorative justice perspective, they think that society needs to do the hard work in order to let the offender know just how they have damaged not just their victim, but the victim's family, the victim's neighborhood and their community, and the real damage that their behavior has had on our society. So they say the best way to prevent crime is for the victim, is for the offender to be confronted by the victim, to actually have to sit and listen to the harm that they've caused the victim, so that they actually see the harm that has come from their crime, so they can actually internalize it. And actually, that's the necessary step to actually restoring the harm that's been done, and then also for preventing crime into the future. Because if you really understand your harm, then maybe you'll think twice about reoffending. Um, from the restorative justice perspective, punishment is often linked to repairing the harm that has been caused. Oftentimes it's sort of low ball. So it'll be sort of like if you were engaged in some sort of property damage, you repair the property. If you've engaged in some graffiti, you repair and fix the graffiti. But restorative justice is used for more serious crimes as well, and it's even been used for murder. That it has, where if a family or a victim is comfortable with it, they will come and they will really talk to the person that murdered their loved one. And if you watch Van Jones's on CNN has a series that sort of focuses on the transformative impact of the restorative justice process. And so there is emphasis placed on conflict resolution, on mediation, on understanding the harm, and that by when groups that war against each other, like gangs, they sort of understand the harm that's done to each of the gangs and the harm that's done to the community. It's easier to mediate those disputes, and similar with domestic disputes. Now, keep in mind that many victims would not want to participate in restorative justice. It would be very, very hard for them to do it. So there's limitations to the restorative justice perspectives. But for those victims who are willing to participate in it, they've oftentimes reported that they do feel a sense of forgiveness. And in fact, they're able to move on from the harm that's done because they're able to forgive that offender, and they no longer think about them in the way that they did prior to that forgiveness. Okay, the last perspective is the equal justice perspective. The main focus of the equal justice perspective is equal treatment. Sometimes the equal justice perspective kind of gets confused with the due process perspective because there's an emphasis on making sure that procedure is followed or that people are treated equally. But from the equal justice perspective, they're not so much focused on due process, that all of the steps in terms of the rights afforded to the criminally accused are like actually made good on. But they just want to make sure that when people are in the criminal justice system, that they are treated equally. They do share with the due process perspective that there are many reasons why people commit crimes, but unequal justice can result in frustration, feeling like one person is treated different than another person, and it might lead to feeling like there's really not any fairness in this system, so qui gives a shit, and then you just sort of like, I might as well just commit crimes because like maybe who knows how I'm going to be treated. So there's not a certainty that's associated with that. And so they think that unequal justice can result in frustration and a lack of trust in the criminal justice system. And restoring trust can reduce frustration and may reduce recidivism as well. The equal justice perspective places emphasis on equal treatment. So they think that regardless of your class, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of your age, that you should be treated equally. So someone coming from this perspective, women are not very likely to get the death penalty in the United States. They also have a lower arrest rate as well. And some people think that's just because like a gender bias, right? Like you don't want to kill a woman or put a woman to death, or that you're more, less likely to arrest. And so the equal justice perspective, they would not like that. They think that men and women should be treated equally by the criminal justice system. They also are big proponents of truth in sentencing. They don't like to have a lot of flexibility in the sentencing. Same offense, same sentence, and that there shouldn't be discretion that is used. And so truth in sentencing is if you are sentenced to 10 years, you serve 10 years. And we have truth in sentencing in the state of Wisconsin. All right, so after watching the lecture and reading in the textbook, you'll get an opportunity to apply these concepts. So the discussion this week gives you an opportunity to apply these concepts. As you'll see that you're going to be assigned a perspective. And so when you go into the discussion, you'll see like there's a link to click on, and you'll see what your assigned perspective is. I also want to let you know that since this is a really big class of 36 people, I've divided y'all up into 2 discussion groups. We didn't do that for the self-introduction just because I wanted you to meet everybody who was in the class. But in order to make it like a more manageable discussion, I think dividing the class in 2 makes more sense. And so you'll see that there are less people participating in your discussion because you're in 2 separate groups. So figure out what your assigned perspective is. Then you are going to describe that perspective and talk about the strengths and weaknesses. And again, you're going to want to make sure that you're not just relying on the lecture, but you're relying on the reading in the textbook as well when you do your discussion. And then you're asked to explain how 2 of the following would do their job if they were governed by the perspective that you've been assigned. So if you were assigned the due process perspective, how would police do their job? If you were assigned the prosecutor, if you are a prosecutor, if you're assigned the rehabilitation perspective, how might a prosecutor do their job? Okay, and so this gives you an opportunity to apply these concepts to what we learned last week with the steps and the roles that people play in the criminal justice process. And then finally, you'll be asked, of the 6 perspectives that we've learned about, which comes closest to your own perspective. All right, sorry if this video is a little bit longer than usual, but I just wanted to get it all into one video rather than break it up into 2. But feel free to pause or whatever as you're going through it, although now you're at the end, well, hopefully you pause. All right, thanks a lot for your attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.